The Coming Soviet Revolution by C.J. Arthur. One second, actually. Fuck. I'll get it later. Let's see. Where am I? What year is this piece of shit from? Fuck. Okay. There we go. Hopefully I'll have the sense to edit this until to now. But hey everybody, this is a piece from the book Trotsky, The Great Debate Renewed. It's from 1972. It's titled The Coming Soviet Revolution, and it's by C.J. Arthur. In spite of Trotsky's tremendous role in the victory of the Russian Revolution, his name will forever be associated primarily with the struggle against its decline, with his patient exposures of Stalin's falsifications of the program and history of the revolution. The unprecedented and unforeseen problems associated with the decline of the revolution confronted Marxism with an acute crisis of theory and practice. No one should deny Trotsky the foremost place among those who seriously faced up to them on the basis of uncompromising revolutionary principle. Unfortunately, Nicholas Krasow's critique of quote, Trotsky's Marxism almost ignores his analysis of Soviet Russia. Probably Nicholas, actually. I think Nicholas Krasow was a editor at New Left Review. Anyway, back to the text. Trotsky's main work in this field, The Revolution Betrayed of 1936, still has not been superseded. Krasow can find no objection to the work other than its, quote, demagogic title, end quote. Indeed, Krasow seems to accept much of Trotsky's position on this question, quote, when many of his followers were manufacturing new, quote, ruling classes and, quote, capitalist restorations, end quote, in the Soviet Union at will, Trotsky, in his analysis of the Soviet state and party apparatus, emphasized on the contrary that it was not a socialist class, end quote. Nicholas Krasow, New Left Review. One might add that the steadiness of Trotsky's vision also contrasts favorably with the outpourings of those who now invent, quote, new czars, end quote, at will. It would, however, be surprising in the extreme if this first attempt, even by a very capable Marxist, to grasp theoretically the meaning of the horrors of Stalinism had succeeded, given the unforeseen nature of the circumstances. I think one can detect a certain forcing of the Marxist categories in Trotsky's attempt to comprehend the new material and to adapt the revolutionary program to the new tasks. Here I try to argue in a tentative way that the concepts relied on in The Revolution Betrayed do not adequately grasp the dialectic of transition from capitalism to socialism. In doing so, I believe I am dealing with a major portion of Trotsky's contribution to Marxism which has so far not been adequately assessed. The received doctrine, shared by all groups basing themselves on the Fourth International, which Trotsky founded in 1938, revolves around the trinity of concepts: A, workers' state; B, political revolution; and opposing the latter, C, social revolution. The doctrine holds that a bureaucratic degeneration or deformation has occurred and requires a political revolution to establish socialism proper, but that no social revolution is required because capitalist property relations have already, broadly speaking, been replaced. The objection that a workers' state can hardly be said to exist when the workers have no rights and are tyrannized by bureaucratic gangsters is circumvented by pointing out that the political form of bourgeois dictatorships can vary from parliamentary to fascist without affecting the social base of society, because the latter is determined primarily by the economic form. Even the Bonapartists, who could not give a damn for the susceptibilities of the so-called ruling class and who dip their fingers in the till as they please, have to have the till filled up somehow, and how this is done determines the nature of society. And again, the critique of people from the bureaucratic, this is me speaking, the bureaucratic collectivist thing would set perspective would say that Chris Arthur is fundamentally conflating the content of capitalism and socialism and the content of a bourgeois revolution with a socialist revolution. And that's kind of what their general critique of people who hold on to the degenerated worker state thesis say that who say that the bourgeoisie's power does not control from its necessarily stem from its control of the state, but its relation to the economy. In a socialized economy where property is nationalized, the fundamental content of that society is dictated by the democratic content of that state. Anyway, it is this doctrine, and in particular the idea that we can so slickly counterpose political and social revolution in our program, that I propose to re-examine. New section. Preliminaries. In the first place, let us note that the unfortunate ambiguity in the term, quote, workers' state. By this, of course, we mean the basic character of society as a whole. The state in the narrower sense of the word, i.e. the institutions of coercion, is acknowledged by Trotsky not to be in the hands of the proletariat, but in those of the political party that has expropriated the proletariat politically. Even so, it is held that insofar as the interests of the bureaucracy itself are connected with nationalized property, it will in some way be likely to defend the latter against capitalist encroachment and thus be, in part, a defender of proletarian interests. So far, so good. However, the neat political-social dichotomy begins to disintegrate when Trotsky argues that it is inexplicable how such a degeneration could occur solely on the political level, and he rounds out his account of the political expropriation of the proletariat by giving this a social basis. Quote, this whole stratum, which does not engage directly in productive labor, but administers, orders, commands, pardons, and punishes, leaving aside teachers and students, must be numbered at 5 or 6 million, ... In the whole mass of the bureaucracy, the communists, together with the communist youth, constitute a block of 1.5 to 2 million, at present owing to continued purgations, rather less than more. This is the backbone of the state power. These communist administrators are the backbone of the party and of the communist youth. The former Bolshevik party is now no longer the vanguard party of the vanguard of the proletariat, but the political organization of the bureaucracy. ... Hypothetically, we may assume that the labor and collectivized peasant aristocracy, the Stakhanovists, the non-party, quote, actives, trusted personages, their relatives and relatives-in-law, approximate the same figure that we adopted for the bureaucracy. That is 5 to 6 million, 12% or perhaps 15% of the population. That is the authentic social basis of the autocratic ruling circles, end quote. Trotsky, the revolution betrayed. Thus, Trotskyists always argue that even the personal dictatorship of Stalin had social roots in a stratum of society, and that Trotsky had little difficulty in showing that this stratum had very considerable material privileges that sharply differentiated its interests from those of the masses. A question that immediately arises if, even allowing for the relative autonomy of the political sphere, we find that this political expropriation has a social basis in such a stratum, can we talk about a merely political revolution when such a revolution would clearly involve dispossessing this stratum not only of this stratum's political expression, but also this stratum's material privileges, especially when Trotsky estimates that over 12% of the population may be involved? In The Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky bases his analysis in the main on antagonisms in the sphere of distribution stemming from a low level of productivity. However, far more important than its effects on distribution will be the effect of the so-called political revolution on production itself. Trotsky does not stress this, partially because of the, quote, administrative bent that Lenin undoubtedly noted, partially, again, perhaps because the low level of the masses in his day makes my point academic, namely the social character of production in the Soviet Union imposes fetters on the most important productive force of all, the initiative and creativity of the worker himself. The completely hierarchical command structure of the Soviet economy makes the individual worker the same kind of labor power machine and nothing more than he is in a capitalist factory. Who can doubt that a new upsurge of proletarian revolution sweeping away bureaucratic privilege would also restructure production itself so as to provide avenues of expression for the enthusiasm and ingenuity of the workers? It is not all a question of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union right wing and the bourgeois press duet of personnel changes, i.e., the replacement of politically reliable but stupid cadres with technically competent cadres, but of the entry of an educated working class into the arena. Such an access of strength to the productive forces again requires us to ask if it can be comprehended by a mere political revolution. Moreover, if with some trepidation one is also forced to speak of cultural revolution here, a new upsurge of proletarian revolution in the Soviet Union could not possibly succeed in changing organizational forms and abstraction from the forms of thought, values, and character of the population. It is perfectly clear that, in many respects, bourgeois values and ideology, superstition, religion, and all kinds of vice profoundly permeate Soviet society. One small example from Wolfgang Leonhardt's Child of the Revolution illustrates this. All right, I'm going to look up this guy. Wolfgang Leonhardt. Wikipedia says Wolfgang Leonhardt lived from 1921 to 2014, was a German political author and historian of the Soviet Union, the German Democratic Republic, and communism, a German communist whose family fled Hitler's Germany and who was educated in the Soviet Union. After World War II, Leonhardt became one of the founders and leaders of the German Democratic Republic until he became disillusioned and left in 1949, first defecting to Yugoslavia, then moving to West Germany in 1950, and later to the United Kingdom. In 1956, Wolfgang Leonhardt moved to the United States, where he was a popular and influential professor at Yale University from 1966 to 1987, teaching the history of communism and the Soviet Union, topics about which he wrote several books. After the Cold War ended, he returned to Germany. Sorry, Child of the Revolution. Wait. See. It's a brief autobiography of an ex-Soviet educated German communist writer and educator. Back to the text. One small example from Wolfgang Leonhardt's Child of the Revolution illustrates this. Wolfgang Leonhardt relates that in Berlin in October 1945, a communist from the West who had spent the war underground accosted Wolfgang Leonhardt in the Central Committee building. Quote. All right, this is a quote from the book. I'll start. And this is an exchange. Quote, I am a KPD official invited here from the West. I've been given some chits for meals, but I don't know where the dining room is, end quote. That depends what sort of ticket you have. He looked at me in surprise and showed me his ticket. It was Category 3, a ticket for less important members of staff. I showed him the way. But tell me, are the meals different for different members of staff in the Central Committee? Yes, of course. There are 4 different kinds of ticket according to the class of work one is doing. The last 2 categories are for technicians and clerks. Yes, but aren't they all members of the party? Yes, of course. They all certified party members, including the chairwoman and chauffeurs and night watchmen. He looked at me in astonishment and said, different tickets, different meals, and they are all members of the party. He turned and went without another word. A moment later I heard the creak of the front door. My comrade had left the Central Committee building. Thoughtfully I crossed the courtyard to the dining room. I went through the rooms in which categories 3 and 4, the lower classes, were fed, and for the first time I had an uneasy feeling as I opened the door into the dining room, is reserved for our category. Here at a table covered with a white cloth, the senior members of staff enjoyed an excellent meal of several courses. Curious, I thought, that this never struck me before. End quote. It's a passage from Wolfgang Leonhardt's Child of the Revolution. What is important in this example is not so much that such a hierarchy exists, but that no one thinks it particularly odd. Values have to change with the structures, large-scale transformations of people's understanding of themselves and their social relationships, if socialism is to come out of this. New section. The basis of the degeneration. There is another vulgar Trotskyist thesis that warrants attention before I proceed. It is held that the case of the Soviet Union's degeneration is a, quote, exception, easily explicable by certain special circumstances that we have no reason to expect generally. Backwardness, isolation, encirclement, and so on. However, though, it is obvious enough that the circumstances cited clearly condition the development. The, quote, exception theory begins to appear oversimple when we consider other experiences. There are now some dozen or more, quote, workers' states, and although there are enormous differences between them, none of them corresponds to the expected, quote, model of socialism. Parenthesis. This leads some undialectical thinkers of an either-or type simply to reject them as capitalist based on brutal logic, bracket formal, and bracket, and the capacity to fly in the face of realities, end parenthesis. All these regimes, like the USSR, in various ways in a transitional state somewhere between capitalism, parenthesis, or colonialism, end parenthesis, and socialism. Indeed, only abstract moralizers with no Marxist understanding could fail to expect that a more or less long period of transition towards socialism is unavoidable. Furthermore, this period cannot be expected to be one of continuous smooth transition. It too must have its dialectic, its periods of decline and renewal. It should be stressed that historical experience proves that any revolution inevitably undergoes a period of ebb, of degeneration, and that its severity depends on the circumstances. In a sense, therefore, the swift rise of bureaucratism in post-revolutionary Russia was conditioned not only by the allegedly exceptional circumstances of the time, it must also be understood as having, in addition, endemic roots in the revolutionary process itself. When the left opposition was grappling with the frightening phenomena of degeneration, Christian Rakovsky was the one who saw this most clearly. Trotsky justly quotes his document on the subject several times in The Revolution Betrayed. In his analysis of the, quote, professional dangers of power, Rakovsky stressed, quote, I do not refer here to the objective difficulties due to the whole complex of historical conditions, to the capitalist encirclement on the outside, and to the pressure of the petite bourgeoisie inside the country. No, I refer to the inherent difficulties of any new directing class, consequent on taking and on the exercise of power itself, on the ability or inability to make use of it, end quote. Christian Rakovsky, The Professional Dangers of Power. The main such inherent feature is that proletarians upon taking power do not automatically become supermen. Proletarians are the same proletarians whose behavior before the revolution fluctuated wildly, to the degree that their confidences rose and sank, limited by their political and cultural experience, the revolutionary seizure of power, by a previously oppressed class that has lived all its life under the hegemony of another class, is by definition an extraordinarily high peak of activity, unity, and consciousness on its part. Is it surprising that, when all problems are not solved the day after taking power, the revolutionary tide begins to ebb? Apathy, cynicism, fragmentation, selfishness, and withdrawal disperse the masses from the stage of history again, leaving behind the apparatus cast out by them. But it is no longer representative of or controlled by the class in whose name it rules. Now the way is open for negative developments in the apparatus itself, developments that reinforce the demoralization of the class. There follow bureaucratic arrogation of power and privilege, careerism and corruption, until finally, instead of expressing the dictatorship of the proletariat, the apparatus exercises dictatorship over the proletariat. How far such tendencies actually go, of course, will be determined by the kind of circumstances usually cited in explaining the degeneration that took place. Also, it goes without saying that, in this case, we do not have simply an objective process, but one that is mediated by particular people and their subjectivity, Stalin, etc., so there's a certain openness about the situation within which subjective factors, e.g., Stalin's jealousy and suspiciousness, help to determine the outcome. Nevertheless, as Marxists, we must recognize that the objective forces do set limits to what even the greatest individual can achieve. It is not a question of saying that if Trotsky had been leader, he would have done the same as Stalin. That is horribly abstract. For Trotsky to have been at the head of affairs, either the objective circumstances would have had to be different from what they were, or Trotsky would have had to have been ... Stalin! Exclamation point. From any objective consideration, the left opposition was doomed to defeat. That is not to say that their struggle was worthless, that they should have helped Stalin or retired into private life. Apart from the psychological impossibility of such a course by a man like Trotsky, they were not in a position at the time to know all the relevant considerations. It was always possible that some new revolutionary breakthrough in the West might have come to the aid of the USSR, which would have changed the conditions of their struggle. Then again, it could be argued that a stubborn rearguard action might ameliorate or slow down a process of degeneration. Finally, it is possible for a revolutionary tendency, even if defeated, to make a positive contribution from the long-term point of view, for when a new upsurge of the revolution comes, it can go back and learn from the struggle and analyses of the heroic groups that kept alive the program of the revolution instead of capitulating to quote realities. That is why The Revolution Betrayed is still an important book today, because The Revolution Betrayed represents not only the dying embers of one revolutionary upsurge, but also a point of renewal for the future. To return to the main point, we have enough experience of transitional regimes to see now that tendencies towards bureaucratic degeneration are endemic to the transitional situation, are internal to the transitional situation, and would have to be guarded against even if imperialism did not exist. All these preliminary questions impel us to attempt to develop a more sophisticated methodology for analyzing transitional regimes. One must grasp the fact that the historical dialectic is not one-dimensional, neither are its phases of a single amplitude. Indeed, it might be more accurate to speak of an infinitely large number of dialectics, of differing social levels, economic, ideological, of differing historical specificity. Contrary to Herbert Marcuse in Reason and Revolution, Hegel and the Rise of Social Theory, published in 1960, there is no reason to suppose that with the abolition of classes, dialectic becomes obsolete and of differing generality with regard to space and time. Thus, from the point of view of a very general historical decline, proletarian revolution may represent a simple moment of transition, but judged internally it reveals enormous complexities that require a more specific historical analysis to supplement the other. Those who think that all that dialectics has to say about the transition from capitalism to socialism is that bourgeois versus proletariat results in classless society, or the relations of private property versus socialized productive forces results in a socialist mode of production, or even both, inevitably fall into a mechanistic or fatalistic views with regard to questions posed at more concrete levels. They tend to reduce the related but autonomous dialectics to a single simple contradiction, and they treat transitional phases with the criteria of formal abstract categories, often of a highly, quote, moral content, instead of grasping their historicity, seeing them as moments of a development, and analyzing their specific contradictions. What I am pointing to here, to put it crudely, is the, quote, Chinese box, end quote, character of the dialectic. We have totalities within totalities, dialectics within dialectics. This involves not only seeing that the transitional period has the transitional period's own phases and stages, but also seeing that an epoch like capitalism is not just a stage in history, but has its own history, i.e., capitalism is made up of a series of transitions. Capitalism does not just grow smoothly up to capitalism's limit. Capitalism has its own internal dialectic in which various subordinate contradictions work themselves out and fetters are overcome. The Common Market Project, for example, is an outstanding case of an attempt by the more far-sighted European capitalists to overcome the fetters of tariffs and piddling markets, and to resolve the contradictions between national capitals by creating European firms in a European market. Once one gets away from concentrating on the simple global contradiction and begins to develop the idea of the dialectics of different levels of specificity, it begins to seem less extraordinary that post-revolutionary societies may exhibit all kinds of contradictions and may ossify into various forms of partial supersession of previous conditions, and that these forms then become obstacles to further development. The disjunction political revolution / social revolution obscures this reality because it locates the trouble, at any rate its terminology, at only one level, thus introducing a radical discrepancy between this level and others. In fact, a more sophisticated analysis would surely show contradictions at other levels. The terminology is an attempt to express theoretically the progressive character of Soviet society vis-a-vis capitalism, but because of poverty-stricken methodological assumptions, it can only visualize being able to do this by locating its, quote, good side in the base and its, quote, bad side in the superstructure. There is a utopian apocalyptic strain in Marxism that views socialism as the final resolution of all contradictions. Personally, I take such talk with a grain of salt, preferring to regard such a resolution as an asymptotic limit never reached. In particular, I reject Marcuse's claim, in Reason and Revolution, that since the dialectic was developed to analyze the history of class societies, socialism makes the dialectic obsolete, and the new development must be understood as a, quote, purely rational, end quote, one. I'm going to look up Reason and Revolution. According to Wikipedia, Reason and Revolution, Hegel and the Rise of Social Theory, first published in 1941 with a second edition in 1954, is a book by the philosopher Herbert Marcuse, in which the author discusses the social theories of the philosophers Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Karl Marx. Marcuse reinterprets Hegel with the aim of demonstrating that Hegel's basic concepts are hostile to the tendencies that led to fascism. The book has received praise as an important discussion of Hegel and Marx. Reason and Revolution explores the philosophical underpinnings of Hegelian dialectics and its influence on the development of social theory, particularly within Marxism and critical theory. It's considered a seminal text that examines Hegel's impact on the evolution of social and political thought. The book has undergone multiple editions and reprints since its initial publication, maintaining its relevance in discussions concerning philosophy, sociology, and political theory. Marcuse attempts to show that, quote, Hegel's basic concepts are hostile to the tendencies that have led to fascist theory and practice, end quote. Marcuse criticizes the thesis propounded by the sociologist Leonard Hobhouse in The Metaphysical Theory of the State, published in 1918, that Hegel provided an ideological preparation for German authoritarianism. In an appendix to the 1960 edition, Marcuse states that the, quote, only major recent development in the interpretation of Hegel's philosophy is the post-war revival of Hegel studies in France, end quote. Marcuse credits the new French interpretation with showing clearly the, quote, interconnection between the idealistic and materialistic dialectic, end quote. Marcuse provides a list of key works, including the philosopher Alexander Kojève's Introduction to the Reading of Hegel, published in 1947. Reason and Revolution was first published by Oxford University Press in 1941. A second edition was published by Humanities Press, Inc. in 1954. In 1960, the book was published in a paperback edition by Beacon Press. The psychoanalyst Erich Fromm praised Reason and Revolution, calling it, quote, brilliant and penetrating, and, quote, the most important work which has opened up an understanding of Marx's humanism, end quote. The historian Peter Gay described the book as one of the most important discussions of alienation in the scholarly literature on Hegel and Marx. Jean-Michel Palmier saw the book as a rejection of Marcuse's Hegel's Ontology and the Theory of Historicity, published in 1932, an interpretation of Hegel influenced by Martin Heidegger. Back to the text. I see no reason for reducing the manifold contradictions of social life to a single class-based dialectic. If one considers this purely rational social development, would it not presuppose that social structures were perfectly transparent, that individuals knew exactly what all other individuals are thinking, and had instant means of mediating their activity? There is also the relation of society to nature to consider. This looks suspiciously like the reinsertion of Hegel's absolute. Curiously enough, the Maoists characterized Liu Shaoqi in a similar way. Quote, in the opinion of Liu, communist society is a bed of roses without darkness or contradiction. All is well without the existence of opposites. ... What Liu is doing here is preaching metaphysics. End quote. All right, I gotta find. Is there a footnote here? Peking Review, May 12, 1967. End footnote. Surely we must recognize that although you can define the development of socialism as proceeding from the free decision of voluntarily associated producers, this is easier said than done. In any complex society, there is always the possibility that the institutions that mediate the activity of people can grow away from them and become so independent and autonomous that eventually antagonisms begin to make themselves felt, requiring a new adjustment in order to restore harmony. See Lenin on the trade union controversy. New section. Alienation. The language of the last sentence has an obvious bearing on the question of alienation. Does alienation exist in, quote, workers' states, and if so, what? Once again, one should guard against reductionism and formalism. On the one hand, at the Kafka conference organized by the Czechs some years ago, the East German delegates stoutly maintained that there was no alienation in their country because alienation is obviously a characteristic of capitalism. On the other hand, the ultra-left C.L.R. James agrees with the equivalence, but concludes that because alienation obviously exists in these societies, they must be capitalist. Exclamation point. That might be a little simple, but I think that's pretty apt in terms of the description of James. These complementary views clearly rest on the crude assumption that, with the expropriation of the capitalists, all problems, including that of alienation, are resolved. It's necessary to stress the category of alienation is an extremely general category that permeates capitalist society in many ways, expressing itself in different manifestations. Very generally, one can define a process or state of alienation as one in which certain expressions of human powers or activity become lost to their originator, assume an independent form, and become external, hostile determinants of his behavior. The concept has been used in the critique of religion, e.g. in Ludwig Feuerbach, of the state in Marx's early critique of Hegel, of capital in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, and Marx's Capital, of commodities again in Capital, especially the section on commodity fetishism, and of capitalist consumption, e.g. in Erich Fromm. It is clear from the generality of the definition that although alienation, reification, fetishism, and the rest are especially acute in capitalist society, one can apply the category to features of a different historical specificity by discerning the particular ways, the specific structures that can helpfully be described in these terms without assuming that we are thereby dealing with a single system. The form of alienation that is historically specific to capitalism is that which expresses itself in the rule of private property, or more concretely, of capital and of commodities, which are, of course, products of alienated labor. The relations between men and production are mediated by one form of estrangement, namely capital. The relation between producers and consumers is mediated by a related form of estrangement, the fetishism of commodities. These mediations constitute the profoundly anti-human content of capitalist society. That is, if one asks, when two men go into a factory, why one can boss the other, the answer cannot be given in terms of any human characteristics, such as superior intelligence, force of personality, or something else. The answer has to be given in terms of their different relations to the non-human entity, capital. That is why Marx so often talks not about the rule of the capitalist, but of the, quote, rule of dead matter, end quote. Capital mediates and often seems to determine the relations of one man to another. Of course, in this relationship, the capitalist finds confirmation of his power, whereas the worker is subjected. Even more ironic is the fact that capital itself is nothing but crystallized labor, so that the worker is being subjected to the externalized product of his own activity. Capital might be crystallized labor, but I don't think crystallized labor is necessarily capital. That's just opinion from me. The more he works, the more products the worker produces for the capitalist, the more surplus value is realized by the sale of these products, and the greater grows the store of capital possessed by the capitalist, non-possession of which determines the worker's subordination. So we see that in his activity, the worker continually reproduces the means of his own domination. Quote, dead matter also rules in the sphere of commodity exchange. Relations between producers and consumers are mediated by and disguised as relations between things. The latter relations, the exchange values, Marx says, are determined, quote, behind the backs of the producers and in association with the general compulsion to accumulate capital, condition what is produced. Now, what happens when all the important concentrations of capital and external trade are expropriated by the revolution and constituted state property? Clearly, this must have a drastic impact on the laws of motion of the economy. It must profoundly modify the character of the estrangements constitutive of specific times and represent the first step in the supersession of specifically capitalist forms of estrangement. It can hardly be said that the accumulation of capital and the movement of the commodity market determine production in the USSR in the same crucial way that they do under capitalism, although they clearly still play a greater or lesser role. In the case of Yugoslavia, greater. For example, the power of man over man is now no longer mediated by capital. Rather, we have an administrative hierarchy, such as you might have in the army or civil service. It is true, of course, that state property still plays a mediating role and that this constitutes a form of estrangement. However, as a matter of fact, just as private property, this movement is a historical necessity. In this connection, Trotsky points out, quote, in order to become social, private property must as inevitably pass through the state stage as the caterpillar, in order to become a butterfly, must pass through the pupal stage. But the pupa is not a butterfly, ... State property becomes the property of, quote, the whole people, end quote, only to the degree that social privilege and differentiation disappear, and therewith the necessity of the state, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote, Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed, page 237. And Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed is on this channel if you're curious. Clearly, though, in the case of the USSR, state property is more than a convenient juridical mediation because of the role played by the bureaucracy, which Trotsky did not hesitate to compare with the fascist bureaucracy. There has always been a somewhat intractable problem of locating the state bureaucracy in the class structure of society. Marx criticized very early Hegel's idealization of bureaucracy. In a striking passage in the 18th Brumaire, Marx writes, quote, this executive power, with its enormous bureaucratic and military organization, with its ingenious state machinery, embracing wide strata, with a host of officials numbering 500,000, besides an army of another 500,000, this appalling parasitic body which enmeshes the body of French society like a net and chokes all its pores, ... End quote. Marx, the 18th Brumaire. This is very reminiscent of Trotsky's description of the Soviet bureaucracy. However, the problem is compounded here by two further features. Quote, in no other regime has a bureaucracy ever achieved such a degree of independence from the dominating class. In bourgeois society, the bureaucracy represents the interests of a possessing and educated class, which has at its disposal innumerable means of everyday control over its administration of affairs. The Soviet bureaucracy has risen above a class which is hardly emerging from destitution and darkness, and has no tradition of dominion or command, ... The very fact of its appropriation of political power in a country where the principal means of production are in the hands of the state creates a new and hitherto unknown relation between the bureaucracy and the riches of the nation. The means of production belong to the state, but the state, so to speak, quote, belongs, end quote, to the bureaucracy. End quote. Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. We shall have to return to this, quote, hitherto unknown relation, end quote, but here I want to argue that, from the point of view of the analysis of the degree of estrangement involved, one must still insist that the character of the subordination of the proletariat by the bureaucracy is distinct from that of its subordination to capital. One way of seeing this is to approach it through Marx's analyses of commodity fetishism and capital. In commodity production, quote, it is a definite social relation between men that assumes in their eyes the fantastic form of a relation between things, end quote. Marx then goes on to contrast this with feudal production, quote, ... For the very reason that personal dependence forms the groundwork of society, there is no necessity for labor and labor's products to assume a fantastic form different from their reality. They take the shape, in the transactions of society, of services in kind and payments in kind, ... Every serf knows that what he expends in the service of his lord is a definite quantity of his own personal labor power, ... The social relations between individuals in the performance of their labor appears at all events as their own mutual personal relations, and are not disguised under the shape of social relations between the products of labor. End quote. Marx. Again, Marx contrasts commodity relations with a community carrying on that community's work with the means of production held in common, in which the labor power of individuals is consciously applied as the combined power of the community. Here, the total product is a social product. Labor time would be apportioned in accordance with a definite social plan tailored to the real needs of the community. Quote, the social relations of the individual producers, with regard both to their labor and to its products, are in this case perfectly simple and intelligible, ... End quote. It seems that one can plausibly argue that the structures and associated consciousness of Soviet society can to a great extent be contrasted with capitalist society in a similar way. Social relations would seem to appear as mutual personal relations rather than take the fantastic form of things. Every worker knows who it is that is pushing him around, from the factory manager up to the presidium. It is partly because the bureaucracy cannot cloak the bureaucracy's privileges that the mystifications of commodity fetishism that a huge apparatus of physical repression is needed. The irrationalities of the Soviet economy are not so hidden as those in capitalism. If a sudden shortage or surplus of some product occurs, everyone knows that, quote, the bureaucrats have messed it up again, end quote. There is some individual, identifiable in principle, who is too busy lining his own pockets or ensuring his political survival to perform his role in the planning system efficiently. In spite of the existence of the mediation of state property, the relationships of subordination seem defined primarily in terms of personal dependence. Though, of course, unlike the identity of person and social position under feudalism, the bureaucrat in his person is only contingently related to his official position. It is an administrative hierarchy open to talent, of a sort, ! In parentheses. And yeah, some historians have talked about the USSR being like an affirmative action state in a certain sense of like granting certain accesses of equality of opportunity within the system, but not, which is different from equality of outcome. Right. However, although state property represents the negation of private property, this antithesis is still posed within the sphere of property, i.e. of estrangement, as Marx observes in connection with what he calls, quote, crude communism, end quote. Quote, the category of labor is not done away with, but extended to all men. The relationship of private property persists in the relationship of the community to the world of things, end quote. Marx. Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. Again, quote, the community is only a community of labor and of equality of wages paid out by the communal capital, the community as the universal capitalist. Both sides of the relationship are raised to an imagined universality. Labor is a state in which every person is put, and capital is the acknowledged universality and power of the community, end quote. So, state property is therefore par excellence an intermediate form. From one point of view, state property is the first form of communism, from another the final term of the property system, universalized private property, hence property in the process of being negated. It should be added, of course, that although in the Soviet Union everyone is juridically equal in respect of state property, some are, quote, more equal than others, end quote. This means that Russia represents the future, but is yet underdeveloped, permeated by conflict, and unsure of itself. It has its own false consciousness, because instead of seeing the activity of each of its members as its own self-sustaining basis, it sees the state as the incarnation and guardian of the socialized economy. This state, unlike the proletarian dictatorship exercised by the armed working class envisioned by Marx, is seen as an external constraint, and the individual is subjugated to a hypostatized universality that nominally includes him, but is a mere ideological covering of the exercise of the interests of the new ruling group. Marx had already criticized this ideology in advance when he wrote, quote, "What is to be avoided above all is the re-establishing of, quote, society as an abstraction vis-a-vis the individual. The individual is the social being. The individual is the social being," end quote. Marx, Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. The ideology includes the usual tired equations: the workers equal the party equal the leadership. People believe this to some extent, especially in the early stages, but now it is known to be a hypocritical fig leaf, and there exists in popular consciousness a definite them-us dichotomy, alienation, even though this may not be understood by a theory that transcends the given categories. So far, we have concentrated on capital and commodity fetishism as forms of alienation. However, these are only specific ways in which man may become alienated from his own activity. In a more general sense, any social system that fails to constitute itself as the free creative expressions of its members must, to some degree, be one of estrangement. 1 second. You sack of shit. After noting the subordination of the worker to his product, Marx goes on to deal with the alienation of the worker from labor itself. Quote, "How would the worker come to face the product of his activity as a stranger, were it not that in the very act of production he was estranging himself from himself? The product is after all the summary of the activities of production, ... In the estrangement of the object of labor is merely summarized the estrangement of the alienation in the activity of labor itself," end quote. Marx, Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. The most vital expression of the life of man is his activity as a creative, many-sided producer. This is what distinguishes man from the stereotyped, instinctual one-dimensionality of animal existence. Marx does not look to communism to provide people with a condition of contented somnolence, but to provide the gateway to the enormous potentialities of self-development, to the fulfillment of the universality of men's powers that are engendered by the whole historical process. The condition of alienated labor, however, is one in which labor is not free self-activity, the conscious exercise of all of man's powers. The condition of alienated labor is merely a means to something outside of labor itself, a means to physical, i.e. animal existence. It is, in the literal sense, quote, forced labor. Working capitalist society is an inhuman degradation. Labor power is treated like any other commodity. The worker is reduced to the level of a machine, with the result that the machine faces him as a competitor. He is reduced even to a cog in a machine, executing plans he does not form, obeying orders whose rationality does not concern him, and unable to gain any satisfaction in his work. In the division of labor, his very adaptability and universality are taken advantage of to reduce everyone to a particular one-sided stunning form of labor. Stunting, not stunning, stunting. Work in a capitalist factory today is an insult to the human spirit. This despotism at the point of production undoubtedly provides more steam for the events of the French May than did questions of consumption, i.e. wages. One concedes that, while implicitly challenging instead of withdrawing from the structures by occupying the factories, the movement did not articulate a correct program of demands for workers' control. Instead, impossibly high money demands were made. In effect, the workers were saying that the slavery we have to put up with simply cannot be adequately recompensed. But what of the Soviet Union? A rationalization of the organization of industry has taken place. This has been achieved by constituting at all levels of the economy the rationality of the capitalist workshop. This is good, but it is not enough. Weird. Quote, "The same bourgeois mind which praises division of labor in the workshop lifelong annexation of the laborer to a partial operation, and his complete subjection to capital as being an organization of labor that increases labor's productiveness. That same bourgeois mind denounces with eager vigor every conscious attempt to socially control and regulate the process of production on an inroad upon such sacred things as the rights of property, freedom, and unrestricted play for the bent of the individual capitalist. It is very characteristic that the enthusiastic apologists of the factory system have nothing more damning to urge against a general organization of the labor of society than that it would turn all society into one immense factory. End quote. Marx, Capital. Though the workshop organization is more rational than macroeconomic anarchy, it remains despotic, maintains a division of labor, especially crippling in the form of a division between mental and physical labor, and makes the labor of the producers a meaningless routine. It is clear that this estrangement from the activity of production, this quote, forced labor, is characteristic of the Soviet Union's industry as much as of capitalist industry. In ideology, this is denied. The Soviet worker has a quite different attitude to his work, finds meaning in it, because he is now working for himself instead of for the capitalist. This is the story. It follows that he has no right to strike because that would be striking, quote, against himself, end quote. This purely ideological connection of the worker with the purposes of the despotic hierarchy over him has no empirical meaning because there exist no mediating institutions that would enable the workers in reality, not in ideality, to control their collective organization, to set their collective organization's purpose, rules, etc. Even if it were true, which of course the workers know it is not, that the purposes of management were to minister to the interests of the workers, these purposes would still not be the workers' purposes, i.e., not an expression of themselves. Paternalism is still despotism. In this case, the state would incarnate the alienated essence of socialist man. The sociality of man would be recognized, but only in an externalized form. Instead of subsisting in the individual and his activity, it becomes displaced into the state and the administration generally. The Stalinist ideology attempts to point up the estrangement by talking about, quote, the state of the whole people, unquote, in a recent programmatic declaration. This is an obvious mystification. The state is an instrument of coercion as such. It must incarnate the power of one class of society over another. Why the, quote, whole people, end quote, would wish to exercise coercive power over itself is a mystery known only to Hegel. He provided a similar metaphysical disguise for the Prussian autocracy and the Stalinist epigons. Generally speaking, we can say that in the absence of concrete institutions of proletarian democracy, Soviets, rights of tendency, workers' councils, etc., talk of the, quote, state of the whole people, end quote, is a mystification of sinister interest. Just as the capitalist lurks behind commodity fetishism, the fetishism of the Soviet state conceals the interests of the bureaucratic stratum. In On the Jewish Question, Marx writes, quote, human emancipation will only be complete when the real individual man has absorbed into himself the abstract citizen, when as an individual man in his everyday life, in his work and in his relationships, he has become a species being, and when he has recognized and organized his own powers as social powers, so that he no longer separates his social power from himself as political power. End quote. Marx. In appearance, the USSR has overcome the separation of individual life and estranged social power of the state, but it has done this by taking the estrangement to its limit, by making every aspect of individual life a political question. The unity is a unity in bondage. It is an imposed and degraded unity, which, while it does have progressive aspects, by taking for granted the right to work, education, and welfare provisions, conceals a terrifying atomization, isolation, and insecurity at the heart of the individual's experience of this false and hypocritical brotherhood. C.L.R. James, in the above-mentioned article of the 40s, describes the situation as follows, quote, "The bureaucracy has no free will. It consumes more than the proletariat. But its social life within itself is a form of jungle existence. No member of the bureaucracy, except perhaps Stalin, knows whether tomorrow his whole life may not be cut short, and he himself and all his family, friends, and assistants disgraced, murdered, or sent into exile. The various strata of the bureaucracy address each other in the same tone and manner as the bureaucracy as a whole address the proletariat. If the proletariat is imprisoned in the factories, members of the ruling party are subjected to a regimentation and unceasing surveillance and inquisition that make the coveted membership in the party a form of imprisonment. The Stalinist official, from the highest to the lowest, excludes his wife and family from any participation, not only in his public or political life, but even in his thinking. It is a measure of protection so that when the arm of the NKVD falls upon him, they'll be able to say with honesty that they knew nothing of his political ideas. That is their slender hope of salvation. Friendship is too great. Friendship is a permanent suspicion. The risk of betrayal by one false word is too great. This catalog of crime, fear, humiliation, degradation, and alienation form from human existence of a whole class, or caste, is the fate of those who benefit by the alienation of labor, end quote. Footnote. It is interesting to look at Marx's early critique of Hegel on the bureaucracy. Quote, Hegel proceeds from the separation of the, quote, state and, quote, civil society from, quote, particular interest and the, quote, completely existent universal, end quote. And bureaucracy is indeed based on this separation, ... For the individual bureaucrat, the state's purpose becomes his private purpose of hunting for higher positions and making a career for himself, ... In bureaucracy, the identity of the state's interest and particular private purpose is established in such a way that the state's interest becomes a particular private purpose opposed to other private purposes. The transcendence of bureaucracy can mean only that the universal interest becomes the particular interest in actuality, and not, as with Hegel, merely in thought and abstraction. This is possible only when the particular interest becomes universal. Hegel proceeds from an unreal antithesis and hence develops it only to an imaginary identity really antithetical to itself. Such an identity is the bureaucracy, end quote. Marx, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. End footnote. Marx criticized bourgeois individualist ideology for making the rest of society and the state an instrument of the individual's egoism. Stalinist ideology makes the individual simply an instrument of the egoism of the state. Such a bizarre notion clearly forms the mystificatory complement to a material estrangement, the subjection of the Soviet people to the Frankenstein monster they brought forth from their revolutionary agony. New section, quote, Bonapartism, ? Let us turn again to Trotsky's analysis. As previously mentioned, the Stalinist bureaucracy appears to have a preponderant role in social life beyond anything previously experienced in history. This is what makes facile comparisons between it and previous etatist formations located within class systems so misleading. The Stalinist bureaucracy not only has state power, but all power in its hands. As Trotsky noted, the class in whose name it rules is utterly without any means whatever of exerting hegemony over this formation, which has separated itself from the class and opposed itself to it. Indeed, some commentators have gone so far as to say that, following the liquidation of the old proletariat, itself a tiny minority in Russian society, in the Civil War and the gradual displacement and final liquidation of their representatives, the Bolsheviks, the Stalinist bureaucracy created and molded the expanded proletariat that is supposed to furnish its basis. Trotsky conceded that, quote, ... the very fact of this appropriation of political power in a country where the principal means of production are in the hands of the state creates a new and hitherto unknown relation between the bureaucracy and the riches of the nation, end quote. Trotsky. The Revolution Betrayed. Trotsky characterizes this new and hitherto unknown relation as one of a gigantic parasitism. However, this metaphor strikes me as giving rather too passive a picture and one too oriented toward distribution. Trotsky's metaphor implies that, attached to an otherwise whole and healthy body, a separate organism exacts tribute. But it is clear that there is no such distinct separation in Soviet society. The bureaucracy is as much constitutive of the body of Soviet society as is the working class. It does not simply levy a toll on the produce of the economy, it organizes production itself, it alone projects the course of the economy. Of course, there are sectors of the bureaucracy solely employed in non-economic functions, necessary for the general rule of the stratum. The army and the political police, including the thought police, which represents an enormous waste of resources surpassing capitalist advertising budget waste. Nevertheless, it is incontestable that the bureaucracy does not simply exact tribute with the mailed fist, but has a basis in production itself right down to the factory level. The mode of production itself is bureaucratic. In this connection, it is interesting to look at what Marx has to say about the managerial stratum. Quote, "The labor of superintendence and management will naturally be required whenever the direct process of production assumes the form of a combined social process and does not rest on the isolated labor of independent producers. It has, however, a double nature. On one side, all labors, in which many individuals cooperate, necessarily require for the connection and unity of the process one commanding will, and this performs a function which does not refer to fragmentary operations, but to the combined labor of the workshop, in the same way as does that of a director of an orchestra. This is a kind of productive labor which must be performed in every mode of production requiring a combination of labors. On the other side, this labor of superintendence necessarily arises in all modes of production, which are based on the antagonism between the laborer as direct producer and the owner of the means of production. To the extent that this antagonism becomes pronounced, the role played by superintendence increases in importance. Hence it reaches its maximum in the slave system. But it is indispensable also under the capitalist mode of production, since then the process of production is at the same time the process by which the capitalist consumes the labor power of the laborer. In like manner, the labor of superintendence and universal interference by the government in despotic states comprises both the performance of the common operations arising from the nature of all communities and the specific functions arising from the antagonism between the government and the mass of the people." End quote. Marx. Capital. Capital Volume 3. This dual function is also apparent in the case of the Soviet bureaucracy. Some of the Soviet bureaucracy's functions and functionaries are concerned with the organization of production, others with keeping the workers subjugated. Here, however, this is not done in the interest of some third group, the rentiers, but through the mediation of state property, simply in the interest of defending the material privileges of the bureaucracy itself. The direct organization of production by the bureaucratic stratum is an independent power. Serving no class but itself represents a new historical situation. Trotsky tries to understand it on the basis of traditional analyses by taking over and making great use of the somewhat problematic term Bonapartism. Quote, Caesarism, or Caesarism's bourgeois form. Where am I? Fuck, where the hell did I go? I accidentally pressed the wrong button. Okay, here we are. Quote, this is a Trotsky quote, quote, Caesarism, or Caesarism's bourgeois form, Bonapartism, enters the scene in those moments of history when the sharp struggle of two camps raises the state power, so to speak, above the nation, and guarantees it, in appearance, a complete independence of classes, in reality, only the freedom necessary for a defense of the privileged. The Stalin regime, rising above a politically atomized society, resting upon a police and officer corps, and allowing of no control whatever, is obviously a variation of Bonapartism, a Bonapartism of a new type not before seen in history, Stalinism is a variety of the same system, but upon the basis of a workers' state torn by the antagonism between an organized and armed Soviet aristocracy and the unarmed toiling masses. End quote. Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. Thus Trotsky sees the novelty solely in the occurrence of a Bonapartist regime in a worker state. But since Bonapartism is supposed to take advantage of a sharp struggle between the classes to perform a balancing function, it is a little hard to interpret this in the case of the antagonism between the, quote, armed Soviet aristocracy, end quote, and the, quote, unarmed toiling masses, end quote. How and in what way could the Stalinist bureaucracy be independent of both camps when the Stalinist bureaucracy constitutes the core of one of them, the side that has all the cards? Sometimes Trotskyists refer to Stalinism as a Bonapartist mediation between the Soviet proletariat and imperialism. But this is even more problematical. True, the Soviet bureaucracy accommodates itself to imperialism and demobilizes the world revolution by playing the, quote, peaceful coexistence, end quote, game. Nevertheless, though this illustrates something about the nature of the regime, I do not find it plausible to use this to explain its basis. After all, any conservative national bureaucracy has to pay some attention to the international conjuncture in its policy. More suggestive, perhaps, than these accounts is to try to compare the situation in Russia with the analysis Marx gives in the German ideology with respect to conditions in Germany around 1800. Quote, the impotence of each separate sphere of life, one cannot speak here of estates or classes, but at most only of former estates and classes not yet born, did not yet allow any one of them to gain exclusive let me repeat this whole thing. Quote, the impotence of each separate sphere of life, one cannot speak here of estates or classes, but at most only of former estates and classes not yet born, did not allow any one of them to gain exclusive domination. The inevitable consequence was that, the special sphere which, owing to the division of labor, was responsible for the work of administration of public interest, acquired an abnormal independence, which became still greater in the bureaucracy of modern times. Thus the state built itself up in an apparently independent force, and this position, which in other countries was only transitory, a transition stage, it has maintained in Germany until the present day, end quote. Marx, Marx and Engels, the German ideology. Is not the situation in which the only forces in the field are primitive peasantry, a dispossessed bourgeoisie, and a small proletariat whose experienced cadres were shattered by civil war and economic collapse, precisely such a situation of universal impotence and of hiatus between a broken social order and an unformed new social order? This thoroughly atomized social situation was reconstituted under the aegis and in the image of the bureaucracy into whose hands power fell. However, the weakness of the, quote, Bonapartist analysis, I repeat, is that it does not do justice to the extent of the bureaucracy's power. Bonapartism is essentially a state form, which, however much it interferes in civil life, leaves the class structure more or less as Bonapartism finds the class structure. The role of the Stalinist bureaucracy in production itself seems to me to go beyond anything that could be comprehended by such analogies with the past. The only sound point in Tony Cliff's book, Russia, a Marxist Analysis, is that, with a nationalized economy, the distinction between the political and social revolution is put in question. Of course, Cliff gives away more than he realizes here, since if this is the case in the USSR, then it must have undergone a profound transformation that makes it absurd to classify it as capitalist, because I take it that Cliff accepts that the distinction can be made in the latter system. Nevertheless, even here one should always bear in mind Marx's remark, quote, do not say that social movement excludes political movement. There is never a political movement which is not at the same time social. It is only in an order of things in which there are no more classes and class antagonisms that social evolutions will cease to be political revolutions. Till then, on the eve of every general reshuffling of society, the last word of every social science will always be combat or death, end quote. Marx, Poverty of Philosophy. Leaving aside the precise way in which one might distinguish political and social revolution, there seems to me no question but that, because of the role the bureaucracy plays in the base production itself,
because of its fettering of the most important productive forces, it represents a social layer related to production in a definite way, i.e., control, and one that is opposed to the working class, and the working class naturally has an interest in controlling production for its own benefit. Even when Trotsky formulates his thesis in terms of, quote, political revolution, Trotsky is forced to mention, quote, social consequences. Quote, the revolution which the bureaucracy is preparing against itself will not be social. Like the October Revolution of 1917, it is not a question this time of changing the economic foundations of society, of replacing certain forms of property with other forms. History has known elsewhere not only social revolutions, which substituted the bourgeois for the feudal regime, but also political revolutions which, without destroying the economic foundations of society, swept out an old ruling upper crust, 1830 to 1848 in France, February 1917 in Russia. The overthrow of the Bonapartist caste will, of course, have deep social consequences, but in itself will be confined within the limits of political revolution. Unquote. Trotsky, the revolution betrayed. Notice here that Trotsky bases his case on the assertion that the bourgeois epoch can and does accommodate itself to radical changes in political superstructures, without these affecting the base. Are we being perverse in questioning this possibility in the proletarian epoch? I do not think so, because it's precisely the separation of political and civil life, that Marx takes as one of the key features of the bourgeois epoch, and this makes such a way of talking plausible in that case, but not necessarily in other cases, for example in feudalism. It is the partial overcoming of this separation, in societies transitional between capitalism and socialism, that produces the sense of strain in carrying over a manner of speaking that was previously appropriate. Again, this is one of the things you hear this in other places. There's a piece by Elmar Altvater called "The Primacy of the Political in Post-Revolutionary Societies" or something like that. And there's and the work of Schachtman that criticizes Deutscher and Trotsky in different ways. Trotsky, the bureaucratic collectivist around Schachtman, kind of viewing the notion of like a Bonapartist worker state as a contradiction in terms. Um, there's the only way that the state in capitalism, the bourgeois rules secured. In Bonapartism, the bourgeois class's power is preserved by preservation of property rights, which allow it to dominate the economic sphere. In After a socialist revolution or a workers' revolution, where that distinction between where that the in the working class revolution, in the proletarian revolution, that distinction between the political and economic life is shattered, because the only way for the working class to effectively control or seize the means of production is as a collective and not as atomized units. You just have property, capitalist property, redistributed to them atomistically. So the idea that you can have a worker state where the workers don't have control of the state is a contradiction in terms, and a lot of people accept this. Trotsky de facto accepted it, or by default accepted it with the degenerated worker state thesis, but also people like Deutscher, who thought that despite despite the butchery of Stalinism, it remained a worker state despite the fundamental heteronymous character of bureaucratic rule in the USSR, which was brutally enforced. Still, it was a form of socialist Bonapartism, worker state Bonapartism that Schachtman and other people have rejected as real. It kind of forms the basis for the bureaucratic collectivist critique, right? Because if you what's it say? Oh, it means that you can have a society in which the means of productions is collectivized without that collectivized production being collectively managed and controlled via a democratic state, which is intent on withering away in some capacity. Um, it means that there is an industrial, exploitative form of society that at least is possible, and in the case of the Soviet Union, they viewed it as really existing. I wonder if Shachtman or Carter or any of these people will be discussed. I've seen Tony Cliff and I've seen CLO James, but I don't know. New section, ultra-left alternatives to Trotsky. One more point on Cliff's position might be useful. The, quote, state capitalist theory is said by orthodox Trotskyists to involve, quote, running the reel of reformism backwards, end quote. This means that just as the reformists envisage the peaceful growing over of capitalism into socialism, so the theory of state capitalism seems to be unable to date the counter-revolution that replaced the triumphs of the proletarian revolution with a form of capitalism. Again, so they must therefore believe in the peaceful transition from socialism to capitalism, hence, quote, reformism backwards, end quote. The date 1928 has been mentioned, but this is so obviously arbitrary that I will spend no time on it. It has also been pointed out that the Stalinist bureaucracy climbed to power over the bodies of the left opposition, though let us not forget the right opposition and the kulaks and middle peasants, so that it was hardly a peaceful process. Nevertheless, the important point is that it was a process. Yet, what seems to have been lacking is the grand historical hiatus that characterizes the classic revolution or counter-revolution, the confrontation of distinct social forces, the moment when everything seems in the balance. One thinks, for example, of the communards desperately defending the gates of Paris against the army of Louis Terre. The parallel here would have obtained if the white armies had stormed revolutionary Petrograd, but they did not. Moreover, the, quote, counter-revolutionaries were already inside the gates. Their leader was soon to sit in the General Secretary's chair of the Communist Party. So the, quote, counter-revolution thesis would seem to run the reel of reformism backwards. But is this a conclusive argument? What are the considerations that lead revolutionaries to reject the reformist strategy? Do these considerations apply with equal force to the reverse movement? To put it plainly, we reject reformism because no ruling class can be expected to give up without a fight, because the institutions mediating the hegemony of the ruling class are not neutral ground, especially the state machine, and because the general ideological, political, and economic hegemony of the ruling class can only be overthrown by basing the movement on its own social forces, organizations, and institutional forms. History has confirmed over and over again this analysis of the impossibility of reformism. In every case, reformists end up defending capitalism against the attacks of the working class. E.g., the Communist Party of France in 1968, or, in extreme cases, go over to the other side and leave the capitalist class in its attacks on the workers' positions, as the Wilson Castle gang in Britain is presently doing. It does seem plausible to argue now that the above-mentioned considerations do not carry so much weight in a case where a revolutionary overturn has only just occurred, so that the hegemony, ideological and institutional, of the new power is relatively precariously established, and the mass upsurge has exhausted itself and begun its long ebb. It is not inconceivable that old ideas with much historical weight, only recently overlaid by new ones, can rapidly re-establish themselves, that deserters from the former ruling class will cross the lines again, and that the recently defeated classes, with their cultural and other resources, will recuperate quickly, lift their heads, and finding the revolutionary body politic exhausted and disheartened, begin to take the opportunities open to them, even capturing strong points in the revolutionary institutions themselves. It is often said that there are some situations of social crisis in which the oppressed masses and their leaders have power in their hands if they only had the confidence to grasp it. May it not be conceivable that, even after ostensibly grasping power, the magnitude of the task appears so great, the resources, moral and material, so scarce, that confidence falters and the masses and their leaders lose their nerve. The rapidly recuperating oppressors become bolder, then perhaps push forward, re-establish their hegemony, wisely integrating it into the numerous cadres, demoralized and place-hunting, willing to overcome. It does not seem to me that such a picture can be ruled out a priori. However, I do not think it gives the key to what happened in the post-October developments. True, the exhaustion did produce a social and political vacuum, but it does not seem to have been filled by the former capitalist or feudal elements, although if allowed to proceed unchecked, the new economic policy may have led to it. The negation of the revolution was not one that returned affairs to the status quo ante, but one that was brought forth was internal to the revolution itself. Just as in developing its power and strength, the bourgeoisie produced its own gravediggers, the revolutionary proletariat, so the proletariat produced its own butchers who would strangle the revolution and build a society in their image rather than the proletariat's. However, because this negation developed within the movement itself on the basis of new conditions and structures, it could not simply be a reinstallation of the former regime. Once again, a movement in the name of humanity has negated conditions that were the negation of humanity. But once again, instead of this negation growing over into the self-sustaining positive, free of contradiction, it has developed its own contradictions and established a new negation of humanity in the form of the repressive bureaucratic machine. Footnote. Quote, atheism is a negation of God and postulates the existence of man through this negation of God. But socialism as socialism no longer stands in need of such a mediation. ... Socialism is man's positive self-consciousness. Man's positive self-consciousness, no longer mediated through the annulment of religion, just as real life is man's positive reality, no longer mediated through the annulment of private property through communism. Communism is the position as the negation of the negation, ... the necessary pattern and the dynamic principle of the immediate future. But communism as such is not the goal of human development, ... End quote. Marx, Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. End footnote. But that this system, permeated as it may be by contradiction, is different from capitalism can only be denied by those who have no dialectical sense and simply lump together all conditions that are formally opposed to truly human conditions. Lump together all conditions that are formally opposed to truly human conditions as indifferently hostile, thus in effect eliminating history as a form of knowledge and going back to utopianism. A difficult problem now faces us of locating the new contradictions in the hierarchy of the dialectic. Is the contradiction between the bureaucratic stratum and the workers on the same level as that between capitalists and proletarians? Or is it a subordinate contradiction, soon to disappear as part of a general working out of the proletarian revolution? But before we go into this, I must expand on my thesis that the dead generation cannot be simply dismissed as capitalist restoration. What the ultra-left critics simply refuse to recognize is the origin of authoritarian strata in the workers' own organizations. They simply spirit in a state capitalist class from nowhere, without explaining its origins. It is useless to point to the old czarist officers. The working class can and did provide plenty of its own bureaucrats. It is not accidental that the same ultra-lefts, who consider the Soviet bureaucrats a state capitalist class, generally see in the trade union bureaucrats in the West nothing but capitalist lackeys, without pinpointing their specific role in the fact that they also have to depend on a working class basis. Conceiving of the proletariat in an essentially idealist way, as the bearers of Simon Pure socialist values, they persistently avoid the problem of bureaucratization that must be understood as a problem internal to the workers' movement. It was relatively easy to avoid the problem in the analysis of the pre-revolutionary period by seeing bureaucratic formations, even including the labor bureaucracy, simply as servants of capital, thus denying that any authentic problem exists here in its own right. This crude approach in the case of Russia results either in denying there is a problem, i.e., an idealist whitewashing of the bureaucracy, or in saying that since bureaucracy was an epiphenomenon of capital before, it must be so now, ergo capitalism still exists. Even formal logicians should be able to spot the error here. Although the taking of state power enormously facilitates the opportunities for bureaucracy, the germ of this development can easily be seen in existing proletarian organizations. The most well-documented study of this that has appeared is Robert Michel's Political Parties, written before World War I, and based mainly on his study of continental social democratic parties, which provided the empirical basis of his well-known, quote, iron law of oligarchy. Michel argues that, in addition to trying to overthrow authoritarian structures, the masses are forced to organize themselves and hence to produce a bureaucracy that very soon takes advantage of its position to pass beyond the control of the rank and file and develop conservative interests. Quote, inspired with a foolish self-satisfaction, the ex-worker is apt to take pleasure in his new environment, and he tends to become indifferent and even hostile to all progressive aspirations in the democratic sense. He accommodates himself to the existing order, and ultimately weary of the struggle, becomes even reconciled to that order. What interest for them now has the dogma of social revolution? Their own social revolution has already been effected. At bottom, all the thoughts of these leaders are concentrated upon the single hope that there shall long continue to exist the proletariat to choose them as its delegates and provide them with a livelihood. End quote. Robert Michel, Political Parties. Furthermore, in order to answer those who assert that the turn towards conservatism in proletarian parties is due to their becoming infected by petite bourgeois recruits, Michel devotes space to proving conclusively that the most conservative and reactionary bureaucrats were of proletarian origin. Michel sums up his position as follows, quote, it is organization which gives birth to the domination of the elected over the electors, of the mandatories over the mandators, of the delegates over the delegators, who says organization says oligarchy, end quote. Michel does not clearly distinguish among three different theses, even though he asserts them all. A, the bureaucracy developed in workers' organizations becomes conservative and joins the existing establishment. B, the workers displace the existing establishment, but in doing so adapt themselves to existing structures so that a change of personnel is effected, but the structure remains. And C, the workers' organizations break up existing structures, but inevitably the new structures provide yet another form of oligarchy. One second. Sorry. He does not clearly distinguish these because, although he counts himself a historical materialist, Michel's conceptual apparatus is very crude, more or less exhausted by the categories of oligarchy, democracy. Thus, Michel's final paragraph embodies a circular model of history. Quote, the democratic currents of history resemble successive waves. They break ever on the same shoal. They are ever renewed. This enduring spectacle is simultaneously encouraging and depressing. When democracies have gained a certain stage of development, democracies undergo a gradual transformation, adopting the aristocratic spirit, and in many cases also the aristocratic forms, against which at the outset they struggled so fiercely. Now new accusers arise to denounce the traitors. After an era of glorious combats and inglorious power, they end by fusing with the old dominant class, whereupon once more they are in their turn attacked by fresh opponents who appeal to the name of democracy. It is probable that this cruel game will continue without end. End quote. Michel. In a direct reference to Marx, Michel denies the possibility of classless society. We shall deal with this later. Returning to the question of the origin of the Stalinist bureaucracy, let us note an underemphasized point in Marx's theory of revolution, namely, that the model of proletarian revolution differs significantly from that of former revolutions. This can be obscured in such dichotomous models of class struggle as are given in the opening passages in the manifesto. Quote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freedman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carrying on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes." End quote. Communist Manifesto. What is immediately obvious here is that society was never reconstituted under the leadership of the subordinate partner of these pairs. Take the destruction of feudalism. This was accomplished under the leadership of the bourgeoisie, itself an oppressing class, not the serfs who were directly exploited by the lords. Of course, it is true that the nobility seemed to concentrate in itself all the evils of society, and that the bourgeoisie was restricted in its development by the nobility and had various complaints about taxation, etc. Thus, the revolt against feudal arbitrariness was carried out under the banner of a universal emancipation rather than of undisguised bourgeois interest. Nevertheless, it is obvious that the underlying reality was the displacement of one oppressing class by another, already existing class. The bourgeoisie had been able to develop its own mode of production up to a point, and on this economic basis to develop its own class power, financial, political, and above all ideological, before taking on the existing order in a more or less sharp period of confrontation. The bourgeoisie, in fact, were the social owners of new productive forces. Instead of a simple contradiction of forces of production, and relations of production, we have a complex introduction in a decomposing mode of production, i.e., both forces and relations, of a subordinate mode of production, i.e., both forces and relations gathering strength like a worm in an apple. The case of proletarian revolution is strikingly different. If it were analogous, one could project a gradual increase in the weight of the cooperatives in the economy, etc. But although Marx sometimes cites the cooperatives as evidence that capitalists are not needed, it is well known that Marx does not base his perspective on them. Whereas the bourgeoisie strove for power, with tangible evidence in their hands of their own capacities, power, and potential superiority over the traditional mode of production, the proletariat must challenge the existing mode of production from within and go, more or less, from nothing to everything. Indeed, it is precisely because they have, quote, nothing to lose, end quote, i.e., no existing privileges, that Marx is confident that they must institute a classless society without exploitation. If the, quote, hand mill gives you the feudal lord and the steam mill the industrial capitalist, end quote, what new productive force does the proletariat control and base the proletariat's thrust for power on? At first sight, because of the location of the proletariat in the existing mode of production, it does not seem possible that the proletariat could claim any productive forces at all, let alone new and superior ones, since by definition the capitalists own them all. However, there is one extremely important productive force that is not the capitalist until the proletariat sells it to him: labor. The productive force that is destined to make socialism based on this is capable of taking the development of technology to its limit, so that eventually labor as such disappears and the economy rests simply on the application of science and knowledge socially acquired and applied. I'm going to repeat that because there's a lot of italics in it. Also, only socialism based on this is capable of taking the development of technology to its limit so that eventually labor as such disappears and the economy rests simply on the application of science and knowledge socially acquired and applied. Footnote, quote, to the degree that large-scale industry develops, the creation of real wealth comes to depend less on labor time and on the quantity of labor expended, and more on the power of the instruments set in motion during labor time, and whose powerful effectiveness, depends, on the general state of science and the progress of technology, With this transformation, the cornerstone of production and wealth is neither the labor which man directly expends, nor the time he spends at work, but rather the appropriation of his own collective productive power, his understanding of nature, and his mastery over nature, exercised by him as a social body. In short, it is the development of the social individual, As soon as labor in its direct form has ceased to be the great wellspring of wealth, labor time, must cease to be its measure, With that, the system of production based on exchange value collapses, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. The problem from the point of view of the proletariat is that the superior organization of labor is only potentially theirs. They know that everything stops when they withdraw their labor, but they do not themselves control their labor. They can only be productively active by alienating it from the capitalist. Given this, one can understand the extreme difficulty of raising to social hegemony a class which economically, politically, and ideologically is almost a nullity. This is the underlying reason for the otherwise surprising phenomena noted by Lenin regarding the need to bring revolutionary leadership, quote, from outside, end quote, the class. Quote, we said that there could not yet be social democratic consciousness among the workers. This consciousness could only be brought to them from without. The history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, i.e. it may itself realize the necessity for combining in unions, for fighting against the employers, and for striving to compel the government to pass necessary labor legislation, etc. The theory of socialism, however, grew out of the philosophical, historical, and economic theories that were elaborated by the educated representatives of the propertied classes, the intellectuals, Similarly, in Russia, the theoretical doctrine of social democracy arose quite independently of the spontaneous growth of the labor movement. It arose as a natural, inevitable outcome of the development of ideas among the revolutionary socialist intelligentsia, end quote. Lenin, what is to be done? Parenthesis, it is necessary to distinguish carefully this point about the origin of Marxist theory from the question of the class composition of the vanguard party. As a matter of fact, this insight of Lenin's was not isolated. Michel quotes several writers of the 1890s on the essential role played by leaders of bourgeois origin, although he appears not to have heard of Lenin. I think this was the general idea of Kautsky as well. I don't think this is something particular to Lenin. This is what some of the people, I think, like Larsley and stuff, put, kind of like try to contextualize Lenin in like the in the Second International Marxism of Kautsky, situate his intellectual development in that context. At this point, some may propose a much more radical revision. If the superiority of socialism over capitalism is supposed to be based on superior organization and on the ability to apply science and technology, may this not imply that the bearers of the new productive forces in capitalist society are not the proletarians at all, but the managers, technocrats, and scientists?
hence the thesis of, quote, managerial revolution, and a new class society based on a, quote, bureaucratic collectivist mode of production. Variants of this thesis identify fascism and Stalinism, consider the mode progressive only for the backward countries unable to develop in the imperialist nexus, or simply condemn it as historically retrogressive, although it is not clear on what criteria. Certainly such a regime would be a million miles away from the appropriation of society's, quote, collective productive power, end quote, envisaged by Marx, because ex hypothesi, most people would be reduced to carrying out the orders of the technocrats. This means that their initiative and creativity would be wasted, and their exclusion from power would actually result in gross inefficiency. The main problem with the thesis of managerial revolution is that it has not happened. The existing managerial strata seem content to follow the program of, quote, modernizing capitalism, and are certainly not flocking in great numbers to lead the revolutionary circles of the proletariat in a hegemonic bloc. Of course, some of them, e.g. scientists in lower technical and office strata, have nothing to fear from anti-capitalist revolution. Equally, there is no evidence that in any of the genuine revolutions, Russian, Chinese, etc., this stratum as a whole was very much involved in a leading and independent force. One problem in selecting this stratum as the leader of revolution, as bearers of a new mode of production, and as a new ruling class, is that Marxism does not seem to be a very good choice to use as an ideology. One would have expected something akin to Saint-Simonism or Fabianism. These considerations lead one to the conclusion that even the sharp inequalities and antagonism between the bureaucracy and the workers must still be understood as the result of a process of internal differentiation going on within the institutions established by the proletariat. To establish their legitimacy, the new layers must in some way base it on the forms of consciousness associated with those institutions, Marxism. Thus, the ideology of the bureaucrats is parasitic on Marxism, whereas the main area of distortion is their account of the state and the party. They cannot take this to its limit because everyone knows about the, quote, withering away of the state, end quote. They must admit, therefore, that their own rule is exceptional and temporary. This makes them a peculiarly unconfident ruling class and heralds an entirely new epoch distinct from socialism. It also means that it is much easier for the proletariat to find its intellectual weapons in official doctrine than it was under the ideological hegemony of the bourgeoisie. Like the structures, the ideology is a transitional one, substitution of, quote, the party for the class, socialism in one country, etc., which attempts to justify the ossified deformation of the revolution. There's plenty of scope for an extensive analysis of the relation of the ideological distortions of Marxism to the precise nature of the transitional regime, end parenthesis. New section, is the bureaucracy a class? In dealing with the question of whether or not the bureaucratic layer should be termed a class, we're in a bit of a quandary because it is not entirely clear how a class is defined. Does any group with special interests constitute a class? Or is property essential? Both Michel and Trotsky seem to think inheritance is important. Thus, Michel argues against Marx as follows, quote, ... social wealth cannot be satisfactorily administered in any other manner than by the creation of an extensive bureaucracy. In this way, we are led by an inevitable logic to the flat denial of the possibility of a state without classes. The administration of an immeasurably large capital, above all when this capital is collective property, confers upon the administrator influence at least equal to that possessed by the private owner of capital. Consequently, the critics in advance of the Marxist social order ask whether the instinct, which today leads the members of the possessing classes to transmit to their children the wealth which they, the parents, have amassed, will not exist also in the administration of the public wealth of the socialist state, and whether these administrators will not utilize their immense influence in order to secure for their children the succession to offices which they themselves hold. End quote. Michel. Trotsky argues that the bureaucracy is not a class because, quote, the individual bureaucrat cannot transmit to his heirs his rights in the exploitation of the state apparatus, end quote. Certainly, Michel's prediction seems to have been refuted by experience. In the USSR, the nepotism that undoubtedly exists has not reached the point that, on the death of an official, his heir is judged to have a right to that position. Rather, this event will tend to signal a downturn in the son's fortunes. He has now lost his protector. However, as against Trotsky's position, it has been argued that the clerical estate formed part of the exploitive class in feudalism by virtue of its relation to the serfs on the church lands, independently of the fact that recruitment to the hierarchy was not hereditary. The point here is that the serf is tied to the land, and only through this to the landowner. It is a matter of indifference to him whether the owner is a person or an institution. Incidentally, I once read in Reader's Digest that Russian agriculture is state feudalist. Marx laid great stress on the freeing of the serfs from the land. As a precondition of capitalism, it made their labor available for exploitation while also putting them under the necessity to sell it, though nominally they were free agents. The basic problem in defining class in such a way as to include all the ruling classes in history is that the different systems under review vary enormously in the way of domination of the so-called ruling class is mediated. In this sense, the concept does not appear to work as a supra-historical static concept, but as a way of referring to a phenomenon that itself has a historical development. As productive systems change, so do the possible mechanisms of dominance. As you move from feudalism to post-capitalist societies, the more accidental the relationship between your person and your social position appears. In feudalism, it is in your blood and birthplace. Membership in the nobility can hardly be separated from the individuality of its bearer. He just is a nobleman. Under capitalism, although we have a hierarchical society, the relationship is less rigid. Quote, personal freedom exists, by which is meant the possibility of finding your own class position. To be sure, property determines this, but it is possible to gain or to lose property. However, the rigidities of property inheritance limit this considerably and place enormous obstacles in the way of someone born into a lower class being able to change his class. In the case of the Soviet Union, we have a hierarchy of administrative or political function. Here the personal and the social functions have become almost completely detached. People can gain or lose positions at the stroke of a pen. From another point of view, capitalism appears as the extreme term. From original community, we have been splintered into atomic individuals. Post-capitalist regimes recognize the social character of production and thus represent a partial return of man to himself. However, this occurs in a paradoxical way because, as previously noted, the social is still alienated from the individual. The institutions of the collectivity are a happy hunting ground for careerists in search of power and privilege. The possibilities of basing dominance on an all-pervasive state administration appears in previous societies only as a hidden potentiality. It could be argued that just as it was possible for the masses to do the dirty work for the bourgeoisie, so it was possible for them to do it for the bureaucracy. The emancipation of society from the common enemy, feudalism, brought out into the light of day other inequalities. It was precisely so in Russia. Hidden antagonisms became open. In previous systems, commodity markets were fringe phenomena that were apparently not basic to the social relations defined by slavery and serfdom. So previously, the state functionary and his interests were seen as subordinate to other classes, based on associated modes of production. Despite state organization of certain branches of production, munitions, Bismarck's railways, modern nationalizations. But suddenly the bureaucratic function is able to move in and take the center of stage when the collectivization of property destroys the power of those it formerly served. Just as the irrational feudal restrictions on labor, i.e. guild serfdom, and on money, usury, condemn the merchant to a marginal role until their breakdown and the introduction of reasonable property law gave him and his capital the chance to flourish. So the manager, technocrat, or bureaucrat has to put up with the irrationalities of private property, its dead wood in the boardroom, its inability to be satisfactorily coordinated by the state, until, when rational planning emerges, The bureaucratic function now appears as the only center of power, and the bureaucrat is unhampered by any other allegiance than to his own interest. Parenthesis. Notice that I refer to the capture of power by the, quote, bureaucratic function, end quote, not by the bureaucracy. This is meant to correspond to the point previously made that, by and large, the capitalist bureaucracy, despite certain conflicts of interest with the property owners, remains under the hegemony of the bourgeoisie. Also, there is considerable mutual recruitment from one layer to the other. Managers acquire shares. Wealthy men go in for politics, etc. It is not the old bureaucracy that takes power so much as the men exercising bureaucratic functions that emerge from the differentiation taking place in the new regime. Incidentally, a great play is made of by the Orthodox about the way in which the bureaucracy, quote, guards the collective property against counter-revolution. It does not necessarily follow, however, that it exercises the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. After all, the bourgeois state, quote, guarded freedoms against the ambitions of the monarchy, but this does not mean that it represented anything but the bourgeoisie, and it was quite possible to have another class oppressed even while they assisted Cromwell to cut off a king's head. The truth is that the bureaucracy exercises its dictatorship in its own interest. It is conservative and thus continually comes into collision with proletarian forces. In addition, in the main, it wishes to protect, quote, its state and economy against out-and-out capitalist forces. This section has been somewhat tentative, but I owe it to the reader to attempt to state a firm position, and I shall now do this in my conclusion. The root cause of the consolidation of a bureaucratic stratum in the Soviet state and economy is undoubtedly the low level of productive forces in the country. From the point of view of world revolution, this kind of intermediary formation in a particular country is not supervised when one considers its long period of isolation before the process as a whole got underway again. Nevertheless, even after the overthrow of capitalism on a world scale, the problem will still exist because it is, at bottom, internal to the nature of post-revolutionary societies and in the struggle to move toward abundance. Michel's, quote, iron law of oligarchy remains a permanent danger, one that becomes less acute as the material basis of society improves, thus allowing the masses to express more of their energy in controlling the direction of social life. And as the masses learn from experience of the danger, the further development of the productive forces in the Soviet Union will bring the present contradiction, economic, political, cultural, etc., to a head, and the future history of the USSR and the establishment of socialism on a world scale will continue to develop on the basis of the working out of further contradictions. The contradiction, as far as the sphere of production is concerned, is that between the productive force represented by the initiative of the workers and the command structure into which they are integrated and which stifles this force. The contradiction between the social forces is that between those who relate to the means of production as controllers and those who relate to it as its slaves. Associated with this are conspicuous differentials in income. Given all this, in spite of its primitive character and its infection by bourgeois norms of distribution, consumer ideology, etc., the USSR is a crucial step beyond capitalism and is still worth defending. Just as Marx said that the proletariat could join with the bourgeoisie in the overthrow of feudalism, but must maintain its own organization to fight its future enemies, so today capitalism is the main enemy, and we must be preparing to smash the existing bureaucracies, not least in order to fight capitalism more effectively, and fight the seeds of authoritarianism already evident in the workers' organizations. The bureaucracy, particularly once in power in society, is a social layer developed on the basis of functional differentiations in the workers' organizations and post-revolutionary institutions, a layer that soon develops interest of its own, becoming a conservative force strangling further revolutionary development. However, precisely because of its origin in the process of proletarian revolution itself, the distinction between the proletariat and the bureaucracy is more ill-defined and variable than the sharp distinction between capitalist property owners
and the proletariat. This means that the, quote, space between capitalism and pure socialism can be filled by an almost infinite variety of transitional forms, in the assessment of which more than one dimension must be taken into consideration. Inequalities in income, distribution of power, even ideological criteria that may help to determine the direction of change, etc. I've concentrated on the USSR as an extreme case. Yugoslavia, China, and Cuba provide more complex but less severe cases, in which one should by no means assume homogeneity in the bureaucracy. There is the political bureaucracy, the technocratic bureaucracy, and even sections still in contact with the masses that might well come over if the latter engage in struggle. Broadly speaking, these transitional regimes are ones in which proletarian power has been deformed and overlaid by bureaucratic power, in which the program of socialist revolution remains in the consciousness of the masses, albeit in a distorted way, so that the bureaucracy has to legitimate itself in these terms, and in which there exist more or less acute contradictions at all levels. The order of the day is overthrow the bureaucracy and establish workers' power. The, quote, program of political revolution, end quote, is not a rich enough concept to do justice to this, even to what Trotsky himself said. Instead, we should understand our program and develop it as one for a new upsurge of proletarian revolution. Instead, we should understand our program and develop it as one for a new upsurge of proletarian revolution. Permanent proletarian revolution must continue throughout the pre-socialist epoch. Its meaning will vary according to the precise nature of the fetters that need to be overcome at each time and place. There is no general formula. The demands that revolutionaries will advance depend upon what is possible and where the contradictions are manifesting themselves. The goal, however, should always be to maximize the opportunities for the creative energy of the masses to express itself. Communism, the fullest expression of human power and freedom, is not a state of affairs to be presented on a platter. Communism grows through history through the continual overcoming of obstacles, the struggle of the masses. Marx already replied to the benignity of certain rulers, or to the possibility of reform from on top, quote, for the production on a mass scale of this communist consciousness, and for the success of the cause itself, the alteration of men on a mass scale is necessary, an alteration which can only take place in a practical movement of revolution. This revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew, end quote. Marx, the German ideology. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening. This is part of I'm reading this as part of a master's thesis on Trotskyist interpretations of the Russian question.